In 1833, on the outskirts of Atlanta, a photograph captured something that should never have been documented. The daughter of a local elite colonel posing alongside three enslaved men in an intimacy that defied all social conventions of the time. The image, hidden for generations in a family trunk, was just the tip of an iceberg of secrets involving forbidden pacts, systematic disappearances, and a macabre discovery that would curse the property for over a century. What began as whispered rumors in enslaved communities transformed into absolute silence in official records. The colonel's daughter, described in period diaries as of robust constitution and explosive temperament, disappeared from public documents in 1834, along with the three men who appear in the photograph. For decades, no one dared question what happened in that isolated smokehouse at the back of the plantation. In 1947, when the property was sold for warehouse construction, workers discovered something beneath the wooden floor that made local police immediately seal the location. Case records mysteriously disappeared from county archives, but oral witnesses transmitted fragments of truth through generations. Only in 2019, when forensic historians gained access to Confederate military archives and private diaries of regional physicians, did the extent of the horror begin to emerge. What they found was not just evidence of individual crimes, but of a deliberate system of erasure involving judges, lawyers, and local authorities in a pact of silence that lasted almost 2 centuries. This is the story of how a forbidden photograph, 3 lives erased from records, and a cursed discovery revealed one of the most disturbing secrets of slavery in the southern United States. Chapter 1. The forbidden photograph, 192 years ago, at an isolated plantation on the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia. Military documents and local records mentioned a case so disturbing it ended up buried in silence. Margaret Thornhill, only daughter of Colonel Edmund Thornhill, disappeared from official records in 1834, but not from the oral memory of the enslaved community. The absence left deep scars marking generations with a silent trauma that only now begins to be revealed. Before we continue, subscribe and activate the bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The photograph, a primitive daguerreotype dated 1833, should not exist. At that time, photography was a newly arrived technology in America, expensive and rare. The fact that someone documented that specific scene suggested both arrogance and premeditation. In the faded image, a white woman of robust constitution appears seated in a wicker chair, flanked by 3 standing black men. The physical proximity between them violated all social codes of slaveholding Georgia. Colonel Edmund Thornhill was known in Atlanta as a respected officer, veteran of the Indian Wars and owner of a cotton plantation, with approximately 40 enslaved people. His daughter Margaret, 23 years old in 1833, had never married, a fact that generated malicious speculation in elite salons. Parish records described her as of difficult temperament and melancholic disposition. The 3 men in the photograph were identified through purchase records. Samuel, 26 years old, acquired in 1829 from a South Carolina plantation. Joshua, 28 years old, born on the Thornhill property, and Benjamin, 31 years old, purchased at auction after a Savannah merchant's bankruptcy. All were described in inventories as strong and healthy workers, a categorization that concealed much darker fates. The photograph's existence only came to light in 1923, when Martha Thornhill, the colonel's great-granddaughter, decided to sell the family property. Among attic objects, she found a locked leather trunk containing not just the daguerreotype, but also 3 diaries written in code, half-burned letters, and a collection of medical receipts dated between 1833 and 1834. Martha tried to destroy everything, but her lawyer, alarmed by content he managed to partially decipher, kept secret copies. The diaries, written by Margaret herself, began mundanely. Accounts of weather, complaints about plantation life monotony, criticism of Atlanta society's hypocrisy that excluded her from balls due to her physical appearance. But starting in March 1833, the tone changed dramatically. Entries became encrypted using code that alternated Latin, Greek, and invented symbols. A historian from Emory University, Dr. Robert Hayes, dedicated 3 years to deciphering the diaries in the 1970s. What he discovered was so disturbing that the university initially refused to publish his conclusions. Margaret wrote about the program, the chosen ones, and the necessary mixture. References to nights in the smokehouse appeared with increasing frequency. The Thornhill Smokehouse was an isolated wooden structure, located approximately 200 meters from the main house. Theoretically used for curing meats, the building had unusual dimensions, almost 50 square meters, with internal partitions and a door that could be locked from inside. Oral accounts from the enslaved community, preserved through generations, referred to the place as the Curse House. In a deciphered entry from June 1833, Margaret wrote, "Father finally understood the necessity. The bloodline cannot end with me. If society rejects me for my form, then I will create my own society. Samuel proved most suitable. Joshua shows resistance. Benjamin accepts with resignation." The medical records found in the trunk were even more revealing. An Atlanta physician, Dr. Silas Worthington, made 6 documented visits to the plantation between August 1833 and February 1834. His notes were clinical and cold, but insinuated something that defied all norms of the era. Female patient presents expected signs. Experimental procedure continues as planned by the colonel. And then, abruptly, in March 1834, all records ceased. Margaret disappeared from church documents, family inventories, and even letters from close relatives. Samuel, Joshua, and Benjamin were also erased from plantation records as if they had never existed. The simultaneous disappearance of 4 people from a plantation would not go unnoticed under normal circumstances. But this was no ordinary disappearance. The silence that followed was constructed through layers of institutional complicity that reached the highest levels of Georgia society. What Margaret, Samuel, Joshua, and Benjamin experienced in that smokehouse remained hidden for 113 years, buried beneath wooden floors and sealed documents. The photograph survived only because it was too dangerous to destroy completely, visual evidence that could implicate the entire Thornhill family if discovered by wrong hands. So it was locked away, hidden in darkness, waiting. The enslaved community knew something terrible had happened. They whispered about screams in the night, about wagons arriving before dawn, about bodies wrapped in canvas, but fear kept them silent. Anyone who mentioned the names of the disappeared was punished publicly. The message was clear. Some secrets were too dangerous to speak aloud, and so the silence persisted, generation after generation, until a construction crew's shovel struck something beneath the smokehouse floor that could not be hidden any longer. Chapter 2. The Constructed Silence. The simultaneous disappearance of 4 people from a plantation would not pass unnoticed in normal circumstances. But this was no common disappearance, and the silence that followed was carefully constructed by layers of power, money, and institutional complicity. The first indicator of conspiracy appeared in Fulton County court records. In April 1834, Colonel Thornhill filed a petition requesting his daughter's removal from public documents for reasons of delicate and private nature. The request was approved by Judge Lawrence Pemberton without public hearing, without questioning, and without justifying documentation. A flagrant irregularity even by the loose standards of the era. 3 weeks later, the same court registered the sale of 3 slaves identified only by serial numbers without names to a Louisiana merchant named Richard Blackwell. The registered price was suspiciously low, $100 for all 3, when a single strong worker was easily worth $500 on the market. Blackwell, later historians discovered, was a pseudonym used in illicit transactions involving enslaved people with legal complications. The enslaved community at Thornhill Plantation knew something terrible had happened, but terror imposed by the colonel and his overseers silenced any attempt at open discussion. One of the most valuable oral witnesses came from Rose Williams, enslaved at 16 in 1834. Her great-granddaughter, interviewed by the WPA Oral History Project in 1937, related the stories Rose told in whispers. Grandma Rose said nobody in the quarters slept right after that night, said they heard screams coming from the smokehouse, screams that lasted hours. Next day, wagons arrived before dawn. White men nobody knew loaded something wrapped in canvas. Miss Margaret was never seen again. Samuel, Joshua, and Benjamin disappeared. The colonel had anyone whipped who mentioned their names. Dr. Silas Worthington also quietly disappeared from Atlanta society. His medical records were transferred to another professional without explanation, and he himself moved to Charleston in May 1834. A letter discovered in 2015 in South Carolina Medical Society archives suggests he left Georgia under circumstances involving matters of professional conscience. The Episcopal church pastor the Thornhill family attended, Reverend Thomas Ashford, made a cryptic notation in his personal diary dated June 1834. I was called to the Thornhill plantation to bless something that cannot be recorded in sacred books. May God forgive us all for our silences. There are sins so great that our society prefers to pretend they never occurred. The construction of silence involved multiple layers of local elite. Lawyers altered documents, judges approved irregular petitions, merchants facilitated illegal transfers, and the church offered its tacit blessing. It was a system of complicity that functioned because everyone had something to lose if truth emerged. In 1835, 1 year after the disappearances, Colonel Thornhill donated a substantial amount for construction of a new courthouse wing. The bronze plaque can still be seen in the building, in memory of Margaret Thornhill, beloved daughter. The somber irony was not lost on the enslaved community, which interpreted the donation as institutionalized bribery. Confederate military archives discovered in 2012 during renovation at the Georgia History Museum revealed another layer of cover-up. A letter from General Howell Cobb to Colonel Thornhill dated 1850 referred to old matters that remain buried as they should be, and thanked the colonel for his discretion in delicate times. What makes the silence even more disturbing is its effectiveness. For 113 years, between 1834 and 1947, virtually no official document mentioned Margaret Thornhill, Samuel, Joshua, or Benjamin. It was as if they had never existed. Birth, death, tax, and census records simply erased them from history. But oral memory persisted. Through generations of descendants of enslaved people, fragments of the story survived. At family reunions, in African American churches, in whispered conversations, the names were remembered. The three who disappeared became part of local mythology, cautionary tales about the absolute power of slaveholders. In 1889, a Northern abolitionist journalist, Sarah Grimke, visited Atlanta researching slavery atrocities. She heard rumors about the Thornhill plantation and tried to investigate. Her request for courthouse archive access was denied. When she insisted, she was informed politely but firmly that certain matters of the past serve better if they remain there. Her notes, discovered in her personal papers in 1975, included a phrase underlined 3 times. What did they do to those 4 souls in 1834? The smokehouse remained standing until 1947, locked and forbidden. Subsequent generations of property owners reported disturbing sensations when passing near the building. Some mentioned inexplicable odors. Others heard sounds they couldn't identify. The structure developed a reputation as cursed, and even hired workers refused to enter. Local authorities actively discouraged investigation. When a regional newspaper attempted to research the Thornhill case in 1912, the editor received visits from prominent citizens who suggested the story was better left untold. The article was never published. The system worked because everyone benefited from silence. Thornhill descendants maintained their social standing. Local officials avoided scandal. The church preserved its moral authority, and the white community as a whole could maintain the fiction that their peculiar institution, while regrettable, never involved crimes of such magnitude. Only the enslaved community and their descendants kept the truth alive. passing it down in whispers, in songs, in coded stories that white society dismissed as superstition and folklore. Chapter 3. The Cursed Discovery. Truth began to emerge brutally on a cold March morning in 1947, when workers from Anderson Construction began demolishing the old smokehouse to make way for a warehouse. What they found beneath the wooden floor made 2 workers vomit instantly, and a third quit his job the same hour, swearing never to return to that ground. James Porter, work foreman, described the scene in a deposition that remained sealed in Atlanta police archives for 58 years. We ripped up the floorboards and immediately smelled a putrid odor that shouldn't exist after more than a century. When we looked down, we saw bones. Many bones. They weren't just buried, they were arranged deliberately. Police were called at 9:37 a.m. on March 14, 1947. Detective Frank Morrison, a war veteran who had seen horrors in Europe, would later admit in a private letter to his brother that, "Nothing I saw in the war prepared me for that smokehouse." Beneath the wooden floor, dug directly into earth, was a chamber approximately 2 meters deep. Inside it, human bones from at least 4 individuals were arranged in a pattern investigators described as ritualistic. But it wasn't just the presence of bones that shocked, it was the context surrounding them. Alongside the remains, they found objects that told a macabre story. Rusted iron chains still attached to rings fixed in the chamber walls, fabric fragments that later analysis identified as white woman's clothing, and enslaved people's work clothes, and most disturbingly, primitive 19th century medical instruments, including a surgical saw and forceps. A leather diary, partially preserved by dry earth, was found in a sealed metal box. The legible pages were from Margaret Thornhill, and her final entries dated from February 1834. The handwriting, initially organized, became progressively erratic. The last legible entry said, "The experiment failed. Father says there is no other choice. Dr. Worthington brings laudanum tonight. Forgive me for what they planned for us." Forensic analysis of the bones, performed by Emory University in 1948, confirmed they belonged to 3 adult men of African descent and 1 white woman. The woman showed signs of bone trauma consistent with childbirth complications. 1 male skull showed fatal fracture caused by blunt object. The other 2 presented evidence of arsenic poisoning, detectable even more than a century later by characteristic bone degradation. Fulton County Sheriff Thomas McKenzie ordered immediate sealing of the location. No press release was issued. Construction workers were instructed to sign confidentiality agreements under threat of lawsuits. The official report simply stated, "Human remains of undetermined origin found on historical property. Case closed due to lack of living witnesses or suspects." But the discovery could not be completely suppressed. Rumors spread through Atlanta's African American communities. Civil rights activists tried to press for complete investigation, but faced resistance from both authorities and Thornhill family descendants, who threatened to sue anyone who defamed their ancestors' name. One of the few preserved records of the incident came from an African-American nurse, Dorothy Hughes, who worked at the municipal hospital and had access to preliminary forensic reports. She secretly copied parts of the document and shared it with the local NAACP. The report included details never made public. Physical evidence suggests the woman died during badly executed obstetric procedure. The 3 men were apparently deliberately executed to eliminate witnesses. Body disposition indicates premeditation and knowledge of concealment techniques. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Warehouse construction was abandoned. No company accepted to continue the project. The land remained empty for 34 years, known locally as the Cursed Peachtree Lot. Nearby residents reported inexplicable phenomena, lights at night, sounds of chains, whispers on windless nights. In 1952, a group of African-American historians from Morehouse College tried to obtain permission to officially exhume the remains and conduct dignified burial. The request was denied by the court under justification that it would disturb public peace and reopen historical wounds better left in the past. The bones were eventually transferred to an unidentified municipal ossuary in 1955, without ceremony, without marking, and without record of exact location. Margaret Thornhill, Samuel, Joshua, and Benjamin disappeared a second time, this time permanently. But the 1833 photograph, encrypted diaries, and clandestinely copied forensic reports survived in private hands, circulating through networks of activists, historians, and descendants of enslaved people who refused to let history be completely erased. The discovery in 1947 should have sparked comprehensive investigation. Instead, it triggered another round of institutional cover-up. The pattern was depressingly familiar: evidence discovered, authorities notified, case sealed, truth suppressed. Just as in 1834, power structures closed ranks to protect the reputation of elite families, even more than a century after the crimes. What made the 1947 cover-up particularly egregious was that it occurred in a supposedly enlightened era. World War II had just ended. America claimed to be champion of freedom and democracy. Yet when confronted with evidence of slavery's most horrific aspects, the response was the same as always: silence, suppression, erasure. The four bodies, once discovered, were treated not as human remains deserving respect and investigation, but as embarrassments to be disposed of quickly and quietly. No death certificates were issued. No burial records were kept. They simply disappeared again, this time into bureaucratic oblivion. Chapter 4. Deciphering the Curse. The true extent of horror only began to be understood when, in 1979, an independent historian named Dr. Angela Morrison obtained access to Margaret Thornhill's encrypted diaries through a private collector who wished to remain anonymous. What she discovered in the codes was not just confession of individual crimes, but documentation of a deliberate experiment in racial eugenics decades before the term was coined. Dr. Morrison, an African American who had lost her academic position at the University of Georgia for researching topics too controversial, dedicated 8 years to completely deciphering the diaries. Working in her Atlanta apartment, surviving on temporary jobs, she meticulously translated every symbol, every Latin phrase, every coded notation. What emerged from the texts was a plan conceived not just by Margaret, but elaborated jointly with her father, Colonel Thornhill, and supported by Dr. Worthington. The colonel, obsessed with continuation of his bloodline but unable to marry Margaret due to social conventions about physical appearance, had created what he called Project Thornhill, a forced breeding program designed to produce heirs carrying his blood, even through methods that violated all social and legal norms of the era. An entry from May 1833, completely deciphered by Morrison, revealed the colonel's thinking. If society judges my daughter inadequate for respectable matrimony, then I will create my heirs by means society will never know. The Negroes under my ownership will serve the purpose God intended: perpetuate the Thornhill line. Dr. Worthington assures the procedure, though unconventional, is medically viable. Samuel, Joshua, and Benjamin were not randomly chosen. Purchase records, cross-referenced with Margaret's notations, revealed specific criteria: optimal reproductive age, robust health, absence of family connections on the plantation that could cause future complications. They were isolated from other enslaved people, moved to the smokehouse, and forced to participate in the experiment under threat of extreme violence. Margaret's entries became progressively disturbed as the program advanced. In August 1833, she wrote, "Samuel resists. His eyes accuse me. I try to explain there is no choice for any of us, but my words sound hollow even to myself. Joshua accepts with a resignation that somehow is worse than resistance. Benjamin cries silently every night. I hear through the wooden walls." The most disturbing aspect revealed by the diaries was Dr. Worthington's clinical documentation. He treated the program as scientific experiment, noting cycles, procedures, and results. His letters to the colonel, some preserved with the diaries, discussed the question of racial mixture, with coldness that preceded eugenicist theories that would dominate racist thinking decades later. In December 1833, Margaret became pregnant. Subsequent entries show a woman progressively terrified by reality of what she had participated in. What grows inside me is product of a sin so great that not even God could forgive. Father is ecstatic. Dr. Worthington monitors everything with his cold instruments. The three men no longer speak to me. How could they? I transformed them into instruments of a purpose that violated their souls. The pregnancy was not normal. Medical notes indicated serious complications from the beginning. Margaret suffered from undiagnosed diabetes, a condition that, combined with her severe obesity, made gestation extremely dangerous with 1830s medical resources. Dr. Worthington prescribed treatments including regular bloodletting and heavy laudanum doses to control pain and anxiety. In February 1834, labor began prematurely. Margaret's last diary entry, written in trembling letters dated February 28th, said, "The pain is beyond any description. Dr. Worthington says neither the child nor I will survive. Father ordered him to do whatever necessary to save the child. I can hear the three men locked in the adjacent room. They know what is coming. We all know. May this curse end with us." The child was stillborn. Margaret died from hemorrhage less than an hour later. Colonel Thornhill, confronted with total collapse of his plan and existence of three witnesses who knew details of multiple crimes, made the final decision. Samuel was killed by cranial trauma, probably executed by the colonel himself or a trusted enforcer. Joshua and Benjamin were poisoned with arsenic, mixed in water offered to them, under pretense of mercy, by Dr. Worthington. All four bodies were buried in the chamber beneath the smokehouse. Dr. Worthington performed an improvised cremation of the stillborn child, its ashes probably dispersed in the nearby river. The colonel then initiated the process of erasing all records, buying silences, altering documents, and constructing the narrative that Margaret had died of typhoid fever while traveling to Alabama. Dr. Morrison published her findings in 1987 in a book called Hidden Bloodlines: Race, Power, and Murder in Antebellum, Georgia. The work was rejected by mainstream academic publishers and eventually published by a small independent press focused on African American history. It sold fewer than 1,000 copies but became a fundamental text for researchers of slavery atrocities. What the diaries revealed was not an isolated case of madness, but a systematic approach to bloodline preservation that treated enslaved people as experimental subjects. The colonel's obsession with genetic legacy, combined with absolute power over human property, created conditions where even the most grotesque violations became possible. The experiment's failure, the stillborn child, Margaret's death, did not lead to remorse or justice, but only to more crimes. The witnesses had to be eliminated. The evidence had to be buried. The story had to be erased, and it was successfully for 113 years. Chapter 5. Echoes of the Curse. The discovery and decoding of the diaries brought not peace but rather a cascade of additional revelations, connecting the Thornhill case to a broader network of similar crimes on other Southern plantations. What initially seemed an isolated case of madness and cruelty began showing contours of a systemic pattern the slaveholding elite had kept hidden for generations. In 1991, inspired by Dr. Morrison's work, a forensic history team from Duke University initiated the Hidden Crimes of Slavery Documentation Project. Using modern document analysis techniques, ground-penetrating radar, and DNA analysis of mortal remains, they began investigating similar rumors at plantations across Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama. What they discovered was shocking in its consistency. At least 17 different locations showed evidence suggesting forced breeding programs involving elite white women and enslaved men, always followed by systematic disappearances and record erasures. The Thornhill Smokehouse was not unique, but part of a broader phenomenon researchers began calling bloodline experiments. Dr. Marcus Washington, forensic anthropologist from Duke, explained in a 1995 interview, "What we're discovering is that certain elements of the slaveholding aristocracy, obsessed with blood purity but confronted with daughters considered inadequate for marriage, resorted to methods we would today recognize as primitive racial eugenics. They viewed enslaved people not as human beings, but as reproductive resources to be exploited for perpetuating their bloodlines. And when experiments failed, or witnesses needed elimination, the legal and social system was structured to permit complete erasures." In 1998, DNA testing on Thornhill family descendants revealed African genetic markers in several lines that officially should not have racial mixture. The discovery caused consternation among some descendants who tried to suppress the results. Others, particularly younger generations, saw it as opportunity to honestly confront their family's past. Jennifer Thornhill Adams, the Colonel's great-great-granddaughter, became a public advocate for historical truth in 2003. In testimony before Georgia's Historical Reparations Committee, she declared, "My family carries blood of both victims and perpetrators. For generations we lied about our history, buried our crimes, and silenced those who tried to speak truth. It's time to acknowledge that Margaret Thornhill, Samuel, Joshua, and Benjamin deserve to be remembered not for crimes committed against and by them, but as human beings whose lives were destroyed by a system that transformed people into property." The location where the smokehouse existed remained empty until 2001, when Atlanta finally acquired the land. Initial plans to build a parking lot were abandoned after protests from civil rights organizations and groups of enslaved descendants. In 2008, the site was designated a historical landmark. In 2015, the memorial to the silenced victims of Thornhill Plantation was inaugurated, a black granite monument with the names of Margaret Thornhill, Samuel, Joshua, and Benjamin engraved in bronze letters. Below the names, an inscription reads, "Their lives were taken, their names were erased, their history was silenced, but their memories persist. May we never forget what happens when absolute power meets people treated as property." The memorial became a pilgrimage site for descendants of enslaved people and anyone interested in honestly confronting slavery's atrocities. Schools began including the Thornhill case in local history curricula, though always with controversy and resistance from some community members who argued that focusing on extreme cases distorts historical understanding. If this story has already gripped you, leave a like. It helps Margaret, Samuel, Joshua, and Benjamin's story reach more people. In 2019, archaeologists obtained permission for limited excavation of the site. Using ground-penetrating radar and non-invasive techniques, they mapped the original structure of the smokehouse and underground chamber. Findings confirmed historical accounts. The chamber had been deliberately constructed as underground prison, with minimal ventilation system and iron rings fixed at multiple points on the walls. More disturbingly, they found evidence the chamber was used for a prolonged period before 1834, suggesting the Thornhill experiment may have lasted longer than records indicated, or that the structure served sinister purposes for years before the final case. Soil analysis revealed chemical traces consistent with human decomposition at multiple locations on the property, raising the disturbing possibility that Margaret, Samuel, Joshua, and Benjamin may not have been the only victims of Thornhill Plantation. Additional remains, if they existed, were long ago dispersed or destroyed by land construction and reconstruction over 185 years. Contemporary debates about how to teach this history continue. Some educators argue for focusing on systemic aspects of slavery rather than individual atrocities. Others insist that understanding specific cases like Thornhill is essential for grasping slavery's full horror. The truth likely requires both approaches, understanding systems while never forgetting individual human beings who suffered within them. Descendants of Thornhill victims and perpetrators now sometimes meet at the memorial. These encounters are invariably emotional, complex, and never fully resolved. How do you find closure for crimes committed nearly 2 centuries ago? How do descendants of perpetrators express remorse for actions they didn't commit? How do descendants of victims accept apologies for pain they didn't directly experience but carry in their DNA? These questions have no easy answers, but the memorial provides space where they can at least be asked, where silence finally breaks, where names once erased are spoken aloud again. Chapter 6. The legacy that won't erase the Thornhill Plantation story didn't end with the 1947 bone discovery or the 2015 memorial. It continues reverberating through contemporary debates about historical reparations, collective memory, and how societies confront shameful pasts. The case became symbol of a broader truth, that slavery's atrocities were even more extensive and systematic than official records admit. In 2020, during the Black Lives Matter movement's resurgence, The Thornhill Memorial became focal point of protests and discussions about racial justice. Activists used the case as example of how power structures historically silenced crimes against Black people, and how descendants of perpetrators rarely face consequences for their ancestors' crimes. The Thornhill Adams family, led by Jennifer and her children, took a rare public position. In a ceremony held at the memorial in June 2020, they formally issued public apology and established a $1 million fund for historical research on Georgia slavery and scholarships for descendants of enslaved people. The gesture was both praised and criticized, some viewing it as genuine reconciliation step, others as inadequate attempt to purchase expiation. Dr. Keisha Johnson, African-American history professor at Emory University and descendant of enslaved people in Georgia, offered perspective in a 2021 article. The Thornhill case forces us to confront multiple layers of violence: the obvious physical violence of slavery, but also the epistemic violence of historical erasure, the structural violence of legal systems protecting perpetrators, and the continued violence of deliberate forgetting. When we say Black Lives Matter, we're also saying that Black lives mattered in the past, and their history deserves to be told completely, not through euphemisms or comfortable silences. In 2022, advanced DNA analysis identified 2 African-American families in Atlanta as possible descendants of Samuel through children he had before being isolated in the smokehouse. The discovery brought profound emotional connection. Teresa Williams, 68 years old, discovered Samuel was her great-great-grandfather. For generations, we only knew that our ancestor disappeared from a plantation in 1834, she said in interview. Now we finally know what happened to him. It's painful, but it's also closure. He has a name. He has a story. He matters. No descendants of Joshua or Benjamin have been identified, raising the possibility they had no surviving children, or their family lines were completely dispersed by migrations and disruptions following the Civil War. Debate about how to preserve and present Thornhill history continues. Some argue graphic details should be minimized to make the site accessible to young visitors. Others insist that softening the narrative repeats the historical pattern of erasing slavery's true atrocities. Memorial administration opted for layered approach, basic information accessible to all, with more explicit details available through additional panels and audio apps for visitors seeking deeper understanding. The case's impact extended beyond Atlanta. Historians in other states began investigating similar rumors in their regions. Discoveries in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama revealed disturbingly similar patterns of bloodline experiments, disappearances, and systematic erasures. The phenomenon, previously considered possible isolated aberration, proved more widespread than anyone had imagined. In 2024, the National Archives digitized and publicly released all Thornhill case-related documents in federal government possession. Researchers worldwide can now access encrypted diaries, 1947 forensic reports, the Colonel's correspondence, and even photographs of the original daguerreotype. Total transparency, advocates argue, is essential for preventing future historical erasures. Margaret Thornhill herself remains complex and controversial figure in debates. Victim of her era's oppressive social conventions? Certainly. But also accomplice and active participant in heinous crimes against 3 enslaved men who had no choice whatsoever. Her diary shows growing consciousness of what was happening's monstrousness, but there was no rebellion, no attempt to free Samuel, Joshua, or Benjamin, no refusal to participate. Margaret was simultaneously victim and perpetrator, observes Dr. Morrison in 2025 interview. Her father exploited her, society rejected her, but she still had power of life and death over enslaved people. Recognizing this complexity is uncomfortable but necessary. We can't simplify history into simple villains and pure victims. Slavery's reality was that the system corrupted everyone it touched, creating hierarchies of oppression where even victims of one type of violence could perpetrate other types. Today, 191 years after the 1834 events, the memorial receives approximately 15,000 visitors per year. Schools bring students, families visit, researchers study, And gradually, very gradually, a story that was buried for almost 2 centuries is being told completely. Truth, as Margaret wrote in her last entry, doesn't disappear completely, no matter how deeply it's buried. It persists in fragments, in oral memories, in bones beneath wooden floors. And eventually, if there's enough courage to unearth it, truth emerges. The Thornhill case teaches that silence is never neutral. Choosing not to speak about atrocities, choosing not to investigate crimes, choosing to let time erase memories. These are active choices that protect perpetrators and dishonor victims. Every generation that stays silent makes the next generation's burden heavier. But the case also teaches that truth has remarkable persistence. Despite every effort to erase Margaret, Samuel, Joshua, and Benjamin from history, they survived, in whispered stories, in hidden documents, in bones that wouldn't decay, in descendants who refuse to forget. Truth waits, patient and persistent, for someone brave enough to bring it into light. The smokehouse is gone, the bones are lost, but the story endures. And in that endurance is a kind of justice, imperfect and terribly late, but real nonetheless. Subscribe to the channel to learn more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the Thornhill Plantation case. See you in the next video.